comments on radio and TV networks. And with that, I would like to welcome Brother Muqtada.
Thank you for the introduction. I want to thank some of my friends who are from Minneapolis, especially Sharid and Rafia. I really treasure and value your friendship. I also want to thank NAI for inviting me here again and again. It's a novel experience. The subject that I'm going to address today the subject that
it only works if you're like 1 inch away.
does it work now?
Yes.
Okay. The subject that I'm going to address today is very dear to my heart, and I sincerely feel that American Muslims need to have very intense conversations and very frequent conversations about this subject. The issue of the relationship between freedom and faith. It is, American Muslims tend to assume that they understand the meaning of freedom and move on and start talking about how to deal with freedom or try to develop institutions on how to cope with the impact of freedom on Muslim identity and Islamic practice. But I suspect that in the 30, 40 years that Muslims have had a significant presence in America, we have not really had a serious conversation amongst ourselves as to what is freedom. And I think it is important that we do that, because if America, inshallah, remains a free country, the freedoms that we experience and enjoy in this country will continue to challenge how we understand Islam and how we practice it. Freedom, as I see it, is a necessary condition, especially for those who wish to believe. Freedom is like an existential condition that enables our humanity. In the absence of freedom, we are not free thinkers, we are not free believers. In the absence of freedom, we are inauthentic beings. In order to be authentic beings, we need freedom. So, freedom enables our humanity, because the faculties that make us human, such as exercise of reason, exercise of skepticism, the exercise of the self-construction of identity, all these qualities that make us human necessarily operate only under conditions of freedom, and they cannot operate under conditions of duress. Therefore, it is very important for us to understand that freedom is a necessary existential condition to make what we believe meaningful. Our faith, our beliefs, our values, our actions, our deeds, our struggles are not authentic unless they have been engaged with through the exercise of free choice. It is only when we exercise the freedom of our will to be Muslims that we are meaningfully Muslims. If we are Muslims under threat of imprisonment, under threat of violence, then that exercise of faith is meaningless. And therefore, it is very important for us to understand that faith, in order to be meaningful, necessarily requires a prior condition of freedom. When Muslims assert their identity as American Muslims, they simultaneously assert faith and freedom. It is very interesting. How can you be both faithful and free at the same time? At a superficial level, you can always argue that, yes, I'm free and I'm faithful. But I think at a much more deeper level, to say that I'm an American Muslim is to confess. It's not to assert. It's to confess that inside us there is a raging dialogue, a debate, a tension between faith and freedom. The moment we assert ourselves as American Muslims, we are asserting that we have engaged in this debate and this dialogue between faith and freedom. Americans have, in the last 200-300 years, to some extent, resolved this tension between faith and freedom. And they have privileged freedom over faith. And America as a polity, as a political system, essentially privileges freedom as a value above all values. And it is the duty, the obligation of this value of freedom to protect faith. So the system privileges freedom as a value above all values, with the understanding that freedom will protect faith. Muslim experience has not been like this. Our experience has been completely the opposite. Often, our assertion of faith has been accompanied by a fear of freedom. And therefore, we simultaneously limit freedom when we assert our faith. It's very interesting if you were to go back and read the early Muslim scholars when they talked about interpretation of religious texts, articulation of Islamic law, what is the Sharia, how do we understand what are the principles of Sharia, how do we understand the Quran, what is ijtihad, what is qiyas. All these questions, when they were being addressed, the common underpinning was the fear of three reasons. Every definition of thought-related Islamic instrument essentially tried to curb the consequences of three reasons. It is a vote of no confidence in the morality of human individuals. The fear that human beings were allowed to exercise their reason fully without any constraint by revelation, then they will go astray. And so, we have always privileged faith over freedom, and in order to protect faith, we have often acted in order to restrict faith. Nevertheless, the history of Islamic thought and Muslim political experience, we have not had the degree of intense discussions, in-depth discussions about what is freedom, why is it necessary, why is it such an important value at all. In fact, it is very difficult to find direct discussions of the political concept of freedom as it is now used in American discourse. The word that we use now in Arabic conversation is hurriya, hur. It comes from the Quranic discussion or distinction between a free man and a slave man. We now use that word in contemporary discourses when we talk about freedom, but in the past, Muslims did not talk about freedom as such. But that does not mean that Muslim intellectuals and Muslim thinkers were not aware of the concept of freedom. There were at least in two areas that Muslims had profound conceptions of what is freedom. The Sufis, for them, the whole purpose of life was to essentially find a shortcut to God, a pathway to God. But the biggest barrier to this pathway to God was the self, the demands of the self, the appetites of the self. And therefore, in order to be one with God, in order to become a true believer, the Sufis insisted and believed that we had to emancipate human beings from their own nafs, from their own hates. The whole notion of tazkiyah, to purify your soul, was essentially to liberate from material needs, from material demands. So for them, to become one with God was the complete liberation of the human spirit from secular, mundane, material wants and needs. And so if you consider that as a form of freedom, you will recognize that Muslims have spent a lot of intellectual capital in building this concept of freedom. You need to be free to be one with God. But if you go back to the traditional, narrower, legalistic notion of what it means to be a Muslim believer, when you say, Iyaka na'budu, it is only you that we worship, it is first a recognition that in order that I be your slave alone, I need to be nobody's slave. I need to be free first, so that I can submit myself only to you. I believe that being a Muslim is like an oxymoron. It's like saying I'm a free slave. I have submitted to the will of Allah, but of my own free will. That's why I like the way we assert the Shahada. It says, La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. The first part is, La ilaha, there is no God. La ilaha illallah, there is no God. Then we assert, but Allah. So when we say there is no God, we are in a state of what Hegel would call as absolute freedom. I mean, forget about a state from whom you seek freedom, a master from whom you seek freedom. There is no God. You are in absolute state of freedom, no accountability to anything at all. And from this state of absolute freedom, then you assert that there is one God, and I submit to this God, and to this God alone. So in a metaphysical sense, in a profoundly philosophical sense, that assertion of submission to God is not meaningful, not worthy of consideration, if it first does not assert freedom. And I think this is a philosophical point that Muslims need to understand, that without freedom, faith is meaningless. Faith derives its meaning from freedom. If someone says, I live in Saudi Arabia, and makes a virtue of the fact that he or she does not consume alcohol, that's not really a virtue. If you live in Ireland or the United States and not drink beer, now that is a virtue. Because there is no social sanction against it, there are no laws against it, you confront it every day. Muslims enjoy sufficient privacy in the US and many parts of the West where they could participate in these kind of activities, but when they choose not to do it purely on religious grounds, it's a much more meaningful abstinence than when you are doing it under duress of law. Freedom is like an antidote. Now we think of freedom as an antidote to tyranny, an antidote to dictatorship. And the popular notion of freedom in the West essentially emerged as an antidote to the tyrannies that the West experienced. Tyranny from monarchs, from emperors, and tyranny from the institutional church. Both institutions essentially curbed the freedom of the masses in Europe. So the popular conception of freedom is essentially freedom from these kind of tyrannies. Fortunately for Muslims, in Muslim history, there isn't such strong evidence of systematic oppression of Muslims, either political or religious. I'm sure many Shias might disagree with me on this. But for a majority of Muslims, there hasn't been a systematic experience of political oppression or religious oppression. There have been episodes, there have been episodic experience, and therefore Muslim political thinkers did not feel the need to articulate the concept of freedom as we think of it. It's like saying we never had a headache, so why assume that our science is weak if we did not invent the Tylenol? The reason why we did not invent Tylenol is because we did not have a headache. The reason why we don't have this sophisticated development of freedom in our historical intellectual past is because we did not have the sophisticated notion of tyranny and oppression that the West experienced. That is important for us to understand. However, the present is not so. We live in a period where most of the free world is outside the Muslim world, and most of the tyrannies are inside the Muslim world. And therefore, now we have a headache. Now we need to import Tylenol if we cannot invent it ourselves. And therefore, it is important for us to have serious conversations about the concept of freedom and how it gels with the notion of faith. I want to go back and address 3 cases in the Muslim past where Muslims have faced the challenge of tyranny. Because Muslims asserted themselves as free from everything else and submitted to the will of God, the notion that Muslims can be oppressed by temporal authorities is un-Islamic. So oppression came in the Muslim world through the usurpation of divine rights. It is when man pretended to be God that he oppressed man in the Muslim world. Because in the Muslim world, we only submitted to God. And that submission was manifest in our assertion of divine law, as only God can make laws. No human authority has or had the authority to determine laws in the past. So when human beings usurped the status of God and the text of God and started asserting authority through various means of opinions and etc., Muslims started experiencing the tyranny of the text. So we have this very peculiar situation that human beings masquerading as text are oppressed. And so this whole debate that the Mutazilites started about free will was very interesting, because they were not just talking about choice, they were also talking about human will. And to me, their insistence on the necessity of human will was an attempt to escape the tyranny of the kind of God Muslims had begun to imagine at that time. A totalitarian God, who and who alone produced everything, to such an extent that human beings were reduced to the status of predestined robots. And therefore the Mutazilites were trying to find the room for human will, the room to err, the room to sin, and saying therefore that justice is meaningless unless we can assume that people commit their crimes of free will. That was one interesting attempt made by Muslims, and neither endorsing them nor condemning them, just pointing to a historical effort and attempt made by Muslims. And then of course the Sufis also asserted their own way of trying to become independent of the text by inventing their own tariqah. It was another way of liberating the Muslims from the tyranny of the text. Now this desire to liberate Muslims from the tyranny of the text is not limited to just the Sufis and the philosophers, but even the Jurists attempted this. The invention of various interpretive tools to understand the Quran, to understand the Hadith, some of them, in my opinion, were designed to escape the tyranny of the immediate meaning of text. The idea of abrogation, that this verse of the Quran is abrogated by that verse of the Quran, or these verses of the Quran are abrogated by certain ahadith, or certain traditions are abrogated. It was very interesting. None of the verses which are cited as abrogated, or the traditions which are cited by abrogated themselves have traditional sources. The Quran saying that this is abrogated, or a hadith saying that these are abrogated. These are attempts by scholars to escape the powerful meaning of the text. So today, when Muslims in the West who like to talk about dialogue and interfaith dialogue and pluralism, cite sources from Surah Al-Baqarah and Surah Al-Ma'idah and say that if you're a Jew, if you're a Christian, if you're a Sabian, you have to fear nothing. There are people who will come back and tell you, no, there are verses from Surah Al-Imran which abrogate these verses. So the pluralism, the tolerance, the respect for other faiths that you claim Islam has does not exist anymore. Because there are verses either in Surah Al-Tawbah or in Surah Al-Imran which have abrogated. That's not what the Quran is saying. The Jews were telling. It's an attempt for them to escape a particular meaning, seeking freedom from the commandment to be tolerant. Then the notion of istihsan, a juristic notion, which is fascinating. When I first read it, I said, oh my God, is this what they're trying to do? It is a juristic idea which says that when you have two meanings of the text, then the jurist can exercise his or her preference to privilege the distant meaning over the immediate meaning in order to protect some higher value. And the defense of this is given from a hadith which says, do no harm and do no injury. And therefore, you can use the higher maqasid to choose a distant meaning of the text rather than the immediate meaning. It is an escape, seeking freedom from literalism. The Muslims have, the point that I'm trying to make is that Muslims have historically attempted to advance the notion of freedom, both freedom of expression, freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, and political freedoms, in the context of the tyrannies that they confront. Today, we live in a period where Muslims in the Muslim world confront political tyrannies, religious tyrannies, a condition where they do not have the freedom to either exercise thought or freedom of conscience. They need to discover the idea of freedom and the obligation to bring that understanding of freedom to them. I think it is the responsibility of American Muslims to awaken a recognition of the idea of freedom among Muslims everywhere. Because when we assert our identity as American Muslims, we are living that tension, that dialogue every day. Now, just because America has had a long experience with this tension doesn't mean that it has resolved this tension. Constitutionally, we have. But there are constant challenges to the U.S. Constitution. I mean, the debate over gay marriage, the attempt by some groups to constitutionally ban gay marriages or constitutionally define what is marriage. The whole issue of abortion and the intense emotions and politics that it conjures in the society clearly tells you that this debate will never be settled. What it invites American Muslims to consider and ponder is that we have to find a balance, a happy balance of faith and freedom, which allows faith to thrive and also ensures that there is no erring on one side or the other. The Obama administration, for example, has gone ahead in supporting a particular legislation at the United Nations level which places restrictions on freedom of speech, an initiative which has been advanced primarily by Muslim countries. It is fascinating. Muslim countries are pushing an agenda at the United Nations which essentially says that we should treat insulting of religions as a violation or as a hate crime and therefore curb the freedom of expression Great. But who gets to define what that is? Ultimately, with every disagreement, if today I disagree with Saudi Arabia and say, no, women have the right to drive, will this be treated as an insult to Islam, and therefore I will be considered as a perpetrator of hate crimes and hate speech? That has been said. Yes, when we talk about the Danish cartoons issue, yes, we recognize the desire to curb hate speech, to incite violence. But we have to find, in good faith and goodwill, that balance. So as far as Muslims living in the West and Muslims living in America, our challenge is to keep this balance in such a way that it maximizes the benefits of everyone. You know, I sometimes jokingly and sometimes seriously say that Muslim goal is such that we use the freedom of religion that is available in America until the day Muslims become the majority in America. And that day we end freedom of religion in this country, and then make sure that everybody follows Islam, make sure all women wear hijab, etc. by force of law. Is this a joke or not? Is a question that I want Muslims everywhere in the US to answer every day. Women have more rights outside the mosque than in the mosque. That makes it very frightening to me. When the entire country becomes a mosque, then what will happen to women's rights, for example? And that is the dialogue that I think Muslims in America need to have frequently and openly. Because ultimately the Islam that we construct here, the Islam that we practice here, is going to be very different from the Islam that is being practiced under duress in other parts of the Muslim world. There are lots of people in America who are free. I can give this talk here. Maybe some of you disagree, maybe some of you agree. And I can come back there and talk to those who agree with me and continue to do those thanks to the protection of the state that guarantees freedom of speech. This kind of conversation may or may not be possible elsewhere in the Muslim world. And so it creates all kinds of different articulations and manifestations of Islam. And we have to deal with that. So what is the challenge for American Muslims? I found an interesting verse in the Quran. It's in Surah Al-Hajj. It's verse number 2241. And when I was reading it, I realized that, oh my God, this is the preamble to a constitution for American Muslims, if we can think of one. The verse is like this: those whom, if we establish them in the land, will keep up prayer and charity, they will enjoin good and forbid evil. Very simple. Those of you whom we, if we establish you in the land, you will establish charity, prayer, and do good and forbid evil. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has established Muslims in this country very well. We all do very well politically, not so much, but financially, economically, we have the freedom to practice religion as we choose. Now, the mandate for us is, what do we push as a good? What is good? And what is evil? We need to have a conversation on that. And one of the conversation is that we have to recognize that freedom is a good that Muslims must protect. Freedom is a virtue that Muslims must protect within their communities and outside. It is not enough for us to object when Muslims are tortured. It is also a responsibility to object when Muslims are tortured. That is the most important thing. That is how we authenticate who we are. That we act, we exercise our morality, we exercise our agency as moral beings completely free. Free from the tyranny of the state, but also free from other kinds of tyranny. And that is the challenge. And that is why it is important for Muslims to understand what freedom is. Because I think that on the day of judgment, we will be held accountable way more than others for the choices that we make. Because we will be making those choices in a greater degree of freedom than others. This is important for us to understand that we will be making these choices from a greater degree of freedom. So what are the challenges? One of the most important challenges that we are going to face from the presence of freedom is in our understanding of our own faith. We are, for the first time in many centuries, I think, Muslims are free to go back and contemplate on the message of Islam and try to understand it anew, to bring a fresh understanding of Islam, without the fear that you will lose your head for exercising your head. And that is happening, and many people are taking advantage of that and advancing alternative understanding of the same sources. So as American Muslims, our job is to provide them an umbrella of patronage rather than to threaten to marginalize. This is important. Because one of the things that freedom has done to other religions is to fragment them. Other communities have become denominationalized. So many denominations have emerged. We will face that situation ourselves if we don't have a big umbrella. And the only way we can have a big tent American Muslim community is by providing freedom of conscience to our own members. Which means that Muslims should have more freedom in the mosque than outside the mosque. That should be our goal. That if you are a Muslim, man or woman, you should have more freedom in the mosque than you have outside the mosque. To think, to express who you are, to understand who you want to be. These are very important issues. One of the great gifts of living in America is the freedom that you get to be who you want to be. You know, when I was in India, I grew up as an engineer with an MBA. There was only one reason why I was an engineer. Because in India, you can be only three things: engineer, doctor, or a loser. It also means a bachelor, by the way. No one can give you a doctor if you're not an engineer or a doctor. And neither now. I'm happy to be a loser. Thanks to America, because America gave me the freedom to be what I want to be. I want to be a Muslim political thinker, a Muslim political philosopher. And that is important. It has created a free environment where you can nurture who you want to be. I don't care if I succeed or fail. That's not important. I don't care whether you all agree with me or if you all disagree with me. The fact that I can do this is the blessing. That's important. The fact that I can live the life as a Muslim thinker is enough. And it's a great blessing that I'm able to construct myself as the kind of Muslim I want. And I will take the chance on the day of judgment. And I think that's what being a grown-up is all about. It's only grown-ups who get to make decisions which are important and live by the consequences of the decisions that they take. So I want to live my life as a grown-up, as a mature Muslim. I don't want to live my life as a child all my life where someone else decides for me what my religion is, what is the right thing to do. That is what I mean by having an authentic expression of your faith, that you know what the risks are of making the decision. That's what mature. We have an opportunity in the United States to manifest a mature form of Islam. An Islam inhabited by believers who are cognitive beings. You know, once the man came to Aisha radiallahu anha and asked her, can you describe to me the personality of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him? And she said, haven't you read the Quran? His personality is exactly like the Quran. It's a very common mashhur hadith. I'm sure a lot of you have heard it many times. But what does it mean? I will offer you one understanding of that. The best way to understand the Quran is to go to the Quran. And the Quran describes the personality of Quran in many ways. And one of the personalities of the Quran that the Quran describes is that the Quran is Quran. That this is a criteria to distinguish what is right and what is wrong. A criteria to distinguish between what is real and what is false. A criterion to distinguish between what is just and what is unjust. That is what the Quran does. It is a criterion that distinguishes. It is an instrument for discernment. So when Aisha radiallahu anha said, the Prophet, peace be upon him, his personality is that of the Quran, in my opinion, she was suggesting that Muhammad himself is Quran. So when we say that the purpose of being a Muslim is to understand and act on what the Quran is and to emulate what the Prophet, peace be upon him, did, then as Muslims, our job is not to grow beards as long as he wore or to wear the clothes that he did. These are very superficial ways of imitation. Our job is not to imitate the Prophet, but to emulate the Prophet. And the way you emulate the Prophet is by developing the capacities of Quran in each one of us to become cognitive, discerning, moral beings. Why are you a human? I am a human because I can make a moral judgment. Why are you a Muslim? I am a Muslim because when I am confronted with a moral dilemma, I can distinguish between what is the right thing to do and what is the wrong. And to be able to develop these faculties inside you as a person, to grow as a human being, you need freedom. You need freedom to grow, to become Muslims. It will be a tragedy that we live all our lives as Homo sapiens and not one day as human beings. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will open the floor open for questions, and then after questions we'll have a book signing. And if you haven't bought his book, we've got 3 copies up here, and I think it's for $10. What other?
I can, you can give my back. I can take as well. I just need a little, first of all, shukran. Just need a little clarity on something because I'm not sure if I clearly understood this point, and then a quick follow-up short question. You mentioned that the American experience has been that the value of freedom supersedes everything else. On the other hand, the Islamic experience, except for the incident, has always been more that the freedom has not been in the discourse of discussions, except for the operation of the incident of Karbala. But again, the clarity I'm looking for is that the initial Islamic was the oppression that happened on the Muslims to begin with. So the experience of oppression started from the very get-go. So the canon law was needed from the very first time. However, the discourse in terms of freedom as a political instrument has been missing, just like in many areas of this initial discussion. Political thinking process has been of absence. I'm just confused in terms of my understanding of that point. Number one, and just I'm going to follow up with the question that I wanted to ask, besides clarity, is that the Muslim majority here and everywhere else, which is really for many of these values, as you spoke about, that the faith really brings the freedom in and the values of human and as a Muslim is there, but the Muslim majority is silent while the religion and these values are being hijacked by the minority. So I've not read the book, I look forward to it, but how do we as a majority start speaking against the very things of which is against the freedom and basic values that our own religion, Islam, speaks of? So those 2 points, please.
I would like you to repeat the question so we can be in the...
Yeah, I did not actually specifically mention Karbala, but the brother once had asked many questions. One of the questions he asked was that he wants to understand how I assert that America has privileged freedom over faith. Number 2, he's asked us to explain to me why I'm arguing that Muslims have not had systematic experience of oppression when Muslims in the first 13 years themselves experienced a lot of oppression. And then his third question is about Muslim majority and how to interpret their silence. I'm not talking about that one experience of Karbala, but yes, I agree with you that the early experience of Muslims until the establishment of the first Islamic state in the state of Medina was an experience of oppression, religious discrimination. And if you know, there are people like Taha Hussein, for example, who distinguish between the first and the second message of Islam. They distinguish the values of Islam which had come to us before Medina and subsequently after Islam became a state. In fact, some scholars have argued that Muslims today in America live like Muslims had lived when they were pre-Medina period. And so we should pay more attention for the Sunnah of early Muslims of that period in order to practice our Islam in America.